Imagine standing on an open plain when the thermometer collapses to 30 degrees below zero. No trees to break the wind, no walls to slow it, no modern furnace waiting somewhere over the ridge. The nearest thing resembling a heating system is hundreds of years away, on the other side of a history that has not yet been written. Exposure, at that temperature, is not a slow discomfort. It is a countdown. Skin loses feeling in minutes. Judgment slips before the body understands what is happening. And the strange thing about a northern plains winter is not that it kills, it is how quickly it does. Now imagine that in the middle of that landscape, hidden somewhere beneath the frost, a family is eating dinner. Children are already asleep. A fire is burning steady and low, and the people gathered around it are warm enough to have removed the heavy robes that would be essential only a few paces outside. You could walk past their home and never see it. No stone chimney climbing into the sky, no tall wooden walls, no smoke visible from a distance, only a rounded mound of earth, quiet under the drifting snow, indistinguishable from the shape of the land itself. That apparent absence was part of the genius. Among the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara of the upper Missouri, the earth lodge was not a crude pit scraped into the soil. It was one of the most sophisticated pieces of traditional architecture ever built on the northern plains. Cottonwood, willow, grass, sod, and earth combined into a single circular structure that carried inside itself an entire engineering system: insulation, ventilation, structural load, food storage, family organization, even spiritual meaning, all folded into a mound that looked like nothing. And that is where the mystery begins. How did people without insulation catalogs, without engineering textbooks, without a single mechanical heating system, learn to design a shelter that did not fight the climate but worked alongside it? The modern instinct is to think of insulation as something manufactured: fiberglass, foam boards, synthetic membranes engineered in laboratories. But insulation does not have to come from a factory. Sometimes the landscape itself already carries it, beneath every settlement on Earth, the ground. Air and earth respond to temperature at radically different speeds. A thin layer of air surrounding a person can change in seconds when a bitter wind arrives. A deep mass of soil changes over weeks. It absorbs slowly. It releases slowly. It resists the panic of sudden weather. The deeper and heavier the earth around a space, the more slowly that mass responds to whatever chaos is unfolding at the surface. In a landscape where the wind can strip warmth from exposed skin in minutes, that difference is not just useful, it is survival. A lightweight shelter left in the open loses heat quickly. An earth-covered structure behaves differently. Its thick walls absorb and release thermal energy in slow, patient cycles. The wind cannot tear warmth out of a roof it can barely feel. Modern sustainable architecture rediscovered these ideas late in the 20th century, dressing them in terms like thermal mass and earth-sheltered design. But the people who built lodges on the upper Missouri did not need the vocabulary. They had something far more reliable: generations of observation. They knew what happened when a roof was built too thin. They knew what happened when a doorway faced the wrong direction. They knew how snow drifted, which timber lasted, how much soil a frame could carry before it groaned. And they knew because mistakes were not theoretical. A mistake could mean a frozen family, a collapsing roof, a lost winter. That knowledge accumulated, generation after generation, until construction itself became a form of inherited memory. But knowing a principle is one thing. Raising a structure that could carry tons of earth on a cottonwood frame, with no cranes and no metal fasteners, was another entirely. Which raises the next question: who actually built these lodges, and who owned them? Picture the prairie before construction begins. No blueprint, no measuring tape, no power equipment, just wind, soil, timber, and knowledge carried inside someone's head. The builders start by finding the center of the future lodge and marking a wide circle around it. Some lodges were modest, others stretched 30, 40, even 60 feet across. A reconstructed lodge at Knife River measures roughly 40 feet in diameter, large enough to hold an entire extended family and much of what they owned. The floor was excavated slightly below the surrounding surface. That small drop was not accidental. It set the interior deeper into the moderating embrace of the earth itself. Then came the structural heart. 4 substantial cottonwood posts were raised near the center. These were not ornamental. They were the skeleton around which everything else grew. Outer posts formed a wider ring. Long stringers connected them. Rafters spread outward like the ribs of a great overturned bowl. Willow branches were woven over the frame. Grasses were layered above the willow. Then earth and sod were piled over the entire structure until the wooden geometry disappeared. What had been a visible framework became a soft, rounded hill. A house became landscape. The rounded profile shed wind. The mass held warmth. The mound resisted the violence of open weather in a way a boxy, exposed building never could. But the most remarkable part of this story is not the material. It is who controlled the knowledge. Among the Hidatsa, women constructed, owned, and maintained the Earth Lodge. An older woman carrying both practical and sacred knowledge often supervised the work, passing techniques down as she directed the placement of each post and the layering of each material. The lodge was not simply architecture. It was accumulated authority made physical. Every angle carried a decision that had been tested by weather. Every layer of earth carried a lesson from a winter someone had already survived. By the time the last handful of sod was pressed into place, the family inside was not just entering a building, they were entering a memory. And once the walls stood and the roof sealed, the hardest problem was still waiting, because a fire could warm the lodge, but a fire also produced smoke, and smoke had to escape without letting the winter come rushing in behind it. At the center of every earth lodge burned a hearth. It was the source of heat, of light, of cooked food, of the low, steady glow around which the family lived. But that fire created a quiet contradiction that could turn dangerous fast. If the lodge was sealed too tightly, smoke accumulated until the air itself became a threat. If the roof was opened too widely, cold and snow would pour down onto the very people the structure was meant to protect. The solution was placed carefully at the highest point of the roof. A single opening, the smoke hole. Heat rises by nature, and as the fire burned, warmed air lifted upward carrying smoke with it toward that opening in the sky. Fresh air had to enter somewhere else to feed the flame. The doorway and its covered entrance passage became part of that circulation, drawing cooler air in low as the hot smoke exited high. In harsh weather, the smoke opening could be shielded rather than left bare to the storm. This is the moment when the lodge stops looking primitive and starts looking like a carefully balanced environmental machine. 3 things were being managed at once. Heat had to remain, smoke had to leave, fresh air had to enter. No fan, no blower, no thermostat, no moving parts of any kind. The system depended entirely on fire, on geometry, on the height of an opening, on the position of a door, and on the fundamental behavior of heated air. It was engineering without machinery, and the builders did not stumble into this arrangement by luck. Cold air behaves in specific ways. So does hot air, so does smoke, so does wind moving across a rounded roof. Each of those behaviors had been observed, tested, and refined across generations until the geometry of the lodge itself became the answer. Yet this was not the only way the problem was solved. Travel south and west, and you enter landscapes where different peoples confronted the same physics with different cultural hands. But the underlying question echoed across the continent. How do you control an environment without owning a machine that controls it for you? The phrase Native American covers an enormous range of societies, environments, and technologies. There was never one universal indigenous house, and it would be a mistake to imagine a Mandan Earth Lodge and an ancestral Puebloan kiva as simple variations on the same theme. They were culturally distinct. What connects them is not shared design, it is shared reality. Across the plateau and the southwest, people developed partially subterranean spaces that used the surrounding earth to soften the climate. In the Pueblo world, some ceremonial structures known as kivas incorporated an elegantly deliberate ventilation arrangement. At Pecos Pueblo, documented and reconstructed features include a ventilator shaft that draws air in from the outside, a deflector positioned between that incoming current and the fire, a central hearth, and a roof entry that also functions as an outlet for rising smoke. Follow the movement of air through that room. Cool air slips in through the ventilator. It meets the deflector, which prevents the cold current from striking the fire directly or chilling the people gathered around it. The heated air, mixed with smoke, rises. The roof opening carries it away. The entire room becomes a circulation system, functioning on nothing but the physics of heat and pressure. It is tempting to file all of this under the phrase passive ventilation and move on. But that phrase hides the human achievement inside it. These arrangements did not appear because ancient builders accidentally punched holes in convenient places. They reflect careful, patient knowledge about fire, about shelter, about how enclosed spaces breathe. When different societies repeatedly face the same environmental problem, they often arrive at overlapping engineering principles, not because they shared blueprints, but because physics is shared by everyone. Cold air still sinks. Hot air still rises. Mass still stores warmth. Wind still finds every unguarded gap. Fire still needs oxygen. Human beings simply learn to work with those unchanging rules in different cultural languages. But engineering was never the whole story of these buildings. Inside the Earth Lodge, the walls did more than hold heat. They held a household. The greatest mistake about ancient architecture is to judge it only by whether it kept someone warm. An Earth Lodge was not simply a thermal envelope. It was a home, a workshop, a warehouse, a social hall, and quite often a sacred space, all folded into a single circular room. Sleeping areas lined the perimeter, tucked against the curving walls where the earth mass moderated the coldest hours of the night. Storage pits sunk below the floor could hold corn, beans, squash, and sunflower long into the winter, protecting the harvest from cold, mice, and time. The central hearth was the anchor of daily life, casting light on faces and tools and drying meat. The family did not simply crawl underground and wait for spring. Life continued. Meals were prepared. Tools were sharpened. Clothing was mended. Children were taught. Stories were told across the fire, while the wind outside rewrote the shape of the prairie. Because several related family members often shared one lodge, the architecture itself shaped social life. The walls held warmth, but they also held generations together, and the 4 central posts at the heart of the lodge carried more than the weight of the roof. Traditional accounts note that the Hidatsa regarded the spirit of the Earth Lodge as residing in those 4 posts, which could be wrapped with offerings. Look at them for a moment, and you can see 2 things sharing the same wood: engineering and worldview, structural load and sacred presence. The roof held up the earth. The posts held up the roof, and the posts, in turn, were held up by something invisible: respect. That is why the knowledge of building one could never be reduced to a set of measurements. You could learn exactly where to put a post and still not understand the lodge. You had to understand what the lodge meant. And you had to be prepared to maintain it, because earth settles, wood ages, snow adds weight, and weather never stops asking questions of a structure. Traditional accounts describe earth lodges being rebuilt periodically, often on something like a decade-long cycle, with women gathering the materials and supervising the work. The technology was not a frozen invention. It was a living process, revised with every rebuild. But even the finest lodge could only do so much. The real battle against a northern winter did not begin when the first snow fell. It began months earlier, in the fields, in the hunt, in the drying racks. The fire inside the lodge was only one piece of the survival system. Fuel had to be gathered before the cold arrived. Food had to be grown, hunted, processed, dried, and stored. For the agricultural communities of the Upper Missouri, winter survival was tied to the productivity of the entire year. Corn, beans, squash, sunflower, meat, hides, timber, fuel. Every part of the household economy had to be balanced so the building itself could keep functioning when the landscape outside became difficult to exploit. The lodge, seen this way, becomes something more remarkable than architecture. It becomes a compact ecosystem. Cache pits below the floor preserved food. Perimeter platforms organized belongings. Sleeping spaces held the family. The hearth held the center. And the earth-covered roof, which looked so heavy and simple from outside, quietly separated the household from the violent temperature swings of the open plains. The builders were not trying to make the prairie behave like a modern heated building. They were creating a smaller, human-scaled climate inside it. The lodge did not eliminate winter. It reduced winter's access to the people inside, and that distinction changes everything. The cold remained. The wind still blew. The river still froze. But the family was no longer exposed directly to the full weight of those forces. The environment had been quietly reorganized around human survival, using nothing but wood, willow, grass, earth, fire, and knowledge. We should be careful not to romanticize what happened inside these walls. Lodges could still fail. Fuel could still run out. Food could still grow scarce. Cold, disease, and hardship did not disappear because someone understood architecture. The achievement was not that indigenous builders made winter harmless. They made survival more possible. They did not conquer nature. They learned its rules. Return one last time to that first image. A northern plains winter, 30 below. Snow moving in long white waves across the horizon. At first you see nothing. Then you notice the mound, rounded, quiet. Covered in earth. From a distance it looks like part of the land. But underneath is a carefully framed human world. 4 posts hold the roof. A hearth burns at the center. Smoke rises. Families gather. Someone tends the fire. Someone remembers how the lodge was built. That memory was the real technology. Not the timber, not the sod, not the geometry. The knowledge that carried it all forward. And when the last earth lodges were abandoned, the engineering did not vanish with them. The structures could sink back into the land, leaving only circular depressions and quiet archaeological traces. But the principles remain recognizable in the architecture of today. Thermal mass, passive ventilation, earth sheltering, buildings designed to work with climate instead of against it. The modern world often measures progress by how much technology we can add. These ancient builders quietly suggest another possibility. Progress can also mean learning to need less fuel, less machinery, less artificial control. And in exchange, more observation, more adaptation, more understanding of the place where you actually live. A low mound may look like nothing, but beneath it could be the remains of an idea that helped families endure some of the hardest winters this continent has ever produced. Because the most remarkable survival technologies are not always the ones that rise highest. Sometimes, they are the ones that quietly disappear into the ground.